You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hi, and welcome to episode 20 of the Social Media and Politics Podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. If you're just clicking on one of our links on Twitter, you can also find us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, wherever podcasts are available. And if you are getting this in your feed because you are subscribed, first of all, you're the best. Second of all, you know that our Twitter account is at SMMP Podcast, and you know we have a Facebook page at facebook.com/Social Media and Politics Podcast. In this episode, I interviewed Daniel Fazekas, who is the founder of a company called Bakamo Social, which is a social media consultancy firm that generally monitors the conversations about brands and different consumer goods, but has recently turned its attention to mapping the social media landscape ahead of the French elections coming up. And I can highly recommend this study. You can go to bakamosocial.com, that's B-A-K-A-M-O, social.com, and check out the study, read it for yourself. It has some, key findings, and then you have the full report, which is, I'm flipping through it right now. It's quite dense, but really interesting stuff. And my original intention was to kind of go through the study step by step, which we sort of do, but then we also get into a sort of bigger discussion about distrust in the media, Russian influence in elections, and kind of what all that means. So it's really interesting, both the work that they're doing and kind of how the trends they find in the French media landscape leading up to the elections are really indicative of what's going on social media right now. The difference between not having a left versus right conversation, but a local versus global elitist conversation, the Russian influence in various spheres in the West. And I think the most interesting of all is the lack of common ground between those who are reading traditional news sources versus those who are looking more towards alternative, counter-narrative type sites. So Daniel and I, we pick this study apart, and then we just get into talking about how this relates to the conversations going on around consumer goods, and what all of this means. And this is the first part of a three-part study, actually. So as those come out, we'll throw them out on Twitter and Facebook. So go ahead and connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and those will be directly in your feeds in one form or another. So let's dive right into the interview with Daniel Fazekas, founder of Bakamo Social. Daniel joins us via Skype from Budapest. Daniel, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics Podcast.
Hi, Michael. Very nice to meet you.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about Bakamo Social? What are you guys doing, and what's the kind of drive behind the company?
Well, I founded Bakamo about 3 years ago now, and it's based on the fact that social media monitoring is so boring. And actually, there's such incredibly interesting information and understanding available from that data if you actually go beyond just counting and coding or something, but you actually read and interpret it. And we do that at scale. So what we do for mostly companies, organizations, NGOs is to find out what people are talking about, but also why. And in this sense, we provide an understanding without asking questions. So the reality that we can report on from social media is in a way more powerful than other research methods because we are not perturbing the data through, asking questions. So we don't go in and ask people, what do you think your latte is too warm or too cold? Or does your, baby screen cream contain too many chemicals? No, we actually tap into the organic, natural conversations and listen if things come up or not. Now, obviously, it's quite resource intense because you never know a priori what you are going to find. So you don't know what you're searching for. But we actually have quite a lot of experience in it and have been delivering studies globally for, quite a while.
Yeah, and what you've recently published is this study, The Role and Impact of Non-Traditional Publishers in the French Elections 2017. What was the kind of motivation behind looking at this political context?
Well, actually, quite simple. We got approached by Open Society Foundation and asked if we could use our methodology to understand the social media landscape around the French elections.
And you were specifically looking at sharing of news or news media. What was the focus on that? Was that something that the Open Society wanted you to look at?
No. They asked us to, they've heard about us. We've worked in the past about on the refugee issues and Ukraine issues. And they've asked us, do you have an approach that we could actually use to bring clarity and understanding and give us an understanding of what's going on? And this is when we actually proposed the observation of links, of shared links in the discourse.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, super timely and relevant issue. I have the report here, so I'll be kind of flipping through it as we go. I want to talk a little bit about the idea and the methods behind it, which is, first of all, which platforms did you look at for this study?
Well, I mean, we use a technology called Talkwalker. It's a Luxembourg-based company. And it's one of the, I would say, top 5 global social media monitoring tools. So what the technology that we use monitors basically everything that's part of the open web. So that's, Twitter, open places of Facebook, newspaper comments, YouTube videos, Vimeo videos, Tumblr, blah, and so on and so on. So everything that either has an open API or it can be scraped or collected or, Firehose, this platform scrapes it together. But also what's very important, it provides historic data. So basically, when we work, we can go back at least 2 years in the data and do our searches. We're not searching the internet, we are searching this technology's database.
And how does it work if it's crawling or scraping so many different platforms? Does it have a kind of, what is it called, a interface that you can,
of course.
And you can kind of see, can you segment it by different platforms, or is it just kind of all in one big?
Well, I mean, like with most of these analytics platforms, their capabilities are amazing, but at the end of the day, these platforms tend to be quite stupid. So you can set it up in many, many, many different ways, but by itself, it won't know a lot of things. So, most people assume then that you can segment per age or what they say. You can't. You can use keywords and you can use some metadata in order to segment. Which is why it was quite important that we used our methodology in order to be able to both understand, so have this qualitative understanding, but also go back into the big data and measure.
Yes, and I think this is exactly the way to go.
This is exactly where we as a company, I mean, sorry for the plug here, but
this problem.
Is where we see ourselves, is to actually go beyond boring numbers and see what the meaning. And you can only see meaning if you read it and understood it and interpreted it.
Yeah.
And there's no algorithm that can actually bypass this.
Right. And so while we're on that point, let's talk a little bit about the methods before we dive into the findings and everything, which is you use a very interesting approach of, as you said, this sort of quantitative big data, but you do a lot of qualitative categorization of different things,
exactly.
And kind of incorporating a sort of interpretation that's then applied back to the data. So can you talk a little bit about the approach there?
I think it's easiest if I take you really and we can dive into it deeper if you have questions, but let me give you an overview and the listeners an overview.
Yes.
Of the whole process, and then stop me if anything is unclear. So basically, the core idea of the study was when people, let me talk about myself. If I want to influence my friends, about something, then I will go into my Facebooks, into my Twitters, into my communities, and say something. Guys, yellow cats are very bad. But no one believes me, so I will actually then go into the yellow hater cat community, find an article, and post that along my opinion, because that's how I actually can say, my meaning, my opinion is based on something. It gives the whole thing gist and it gives it something powerful. And you can look at the conversations you have with your friends on Twitter and Facebook. Tons of people are sharing links about their opinions and about the themes that they care about. And it's a way of expressing opinion, but being sort of intellectual about it and say, it's not just I hate yellow, but here's 5 other arguments why yellow is bad. that was the core, like the idea that's behind the study, is looking at the sharing behavior across the political discourse can lead us to a unique way of looking at the social media landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And it combines the news offering, so the media offering, but also the engagement of people with it. Because social media is sort of a weird space because it's both individual expressions, but it's also mass. And it's also about who is loudest and which opinion is loudest. So you have these both aspects colliding. And with most people actually learning about news through social media and through having that social graph in between the media and themselves, this is actually the sharing behavior is quite central to the political discourse.
Yeah, this is the social aspect of social media, right? This kind of sharing and interaction.
Yes, but I would want you to see this individual behavior of me sharing a link about, anything. Means that I stress my opinion, I base it on something, and I actually want you or my community to read this article. So in a way, I both argue with it, but also amplify the message of or the reach of these social media sources where articles come from. There's another important definition that we used in this study, is that we focused on long-form articles. So for a news site to be included, it had to publish long-form articles. Long-form meant more than one paragraph.
Mm-hmm. So kind of substantial information.
Exactly. We wanted to get away from that 140 Twitter character space and actually look at that sphere where more complex opinions are being developed.
Yeah, and then what you do in the study is you develop this media map.
Yes.
And what you do is you sort of classify the types of news or the sources of news according to 5 criteria. You have the kind of traditional news sources, alternative news sources. Can you go a little bit into that?
Yeah, but maybe I want to do a step in between and just make sure that everyone understands the methodology. So what we've done with our platform is we've built a semantic keyword grid that encompassed really everything we and our experts could think of would come up in a political conversation. So it was like, I think 4 dimensions or 4 types of keywords. There were keywords related to the institution of the elections, like first round, second round, presidential elections, voter commission, all kinds of things that are related to the elections. Mm-hmm. Then there were all the party and names of all parties and all of the candidates, and also a lot of the issues that are, often emerging, and people might say something about an issue, but not mention a politician's name.
Right.
So we then cast this web and pulled in, something like 25 million, like a massive number of conversations that took place previously. I think we took a 6-month sample, and we've analyzed it for messages that entailed links. And we extracted these links and took, the top 5,000 and started actually poking in around this. And this is when our qualitative understanding phase started.
Right. And this is kind of an approach that a lot of researchers are using as well, is to develop a kind of dictionary of keywords for political content or things that might indicate that the post is political, filter from all the noise, right? Because there's lots of other stuff on social media.
There are about 20 billion messages going through every day.
Crazy. So you create a dictionary of political keywords. You filter those out from the data, and then you look only at those with links that are attached, right?
Exactly. Yeah, actually the only real way to search social media currently is keywords. Mm-hmm. There are some attempts to do something on images, but it's by far not really working yet.
Right.
So you actually need to have the concrete consumer language, the actual words that people use. And that's very important for social is, you can't just say, oh, I want political messages. You actually have to have the concrete words and phrases that people use.
Yeah, I just want to ask, because we're kind of getting into the nitty gritty here. If someone posted only a hyperlink, but not any content. So there's sort of a difference between, some people will put a link to an article.
Definitely. I get your point. The question is, we would not have caught that link. Mm-hmm. Yes, but actually the phase I was just mentioning was the discovery phase. So we assumed, law of big numbers, eventually people will also share the same link with some phrases. I mean, the numbers were immense. And we were actually really looking at the domains. People share articles, but we actually cleanse this data in order to get a list of the top domains to which links are pointing.
Right. And yeah, we kind of went on a tangent there, but let's talk about those initial 5,000 and that kind of human classification, or kind of going in inductively and seeing what's...
Indeed. I mean, we used two teams, really, an analyst team and a sifter team. The sifter team was, I think, 15 people. Our analyst team was 5. Mm-hmm. So we, because we believe in, because in social you don't actually know what you're getting, we tend to operate with quite broad and open semantic keyword grids. So we also got a lot of garbage pointing to things that are not relevant. And for us, relevant was websites that regularly publish long-form content. So we went through every individual page on this 5,000 list and removed the ones that were not relevant.
Right. Like not like I don't know, maybe established sites is the right word, but you were looking to see whether the site kind of regularly posts long form news.
Yeah. Did it produce some sort of political content that was cast in long form? So in the meanwhile, our analyst team started just reading, and we started collecting and diving into groups and coming up with ways on clustering these and actually moving them around. And we ended up with a set of, I think, 800 top websites that we actually managed to code and analyze in depth. And for each of them, we read several articles. We looked at, how it looked like, what are the advertisements on it, who do they cite, do they have a blog roll, do they point to other content, what's the tone that they are working on or that they're using, what are the typical topics covered by this, and so we actually looked at it quite in depth.
Yeah, I mean 800 sites, which is the kind of the number you arrived at, is a lot of sources. I mean, and this was all in French, right? You're kind of trying to close down just the French social media landscape.
Yeah. I mean, we are aware that there are, things coming out from the US and this, the Pepper the Frog, and their influences from other places. But, we really wanted to focus on this French media landscape. So
you have these 800 sites that kind of regularly post long-form news in some form of another. What's the next step?
Well, the next step was that we did it's actually, I'm not sure how familiar you or listeners are with qualitative methodology, but it is basically a natural sort. If you think of a focus group or some other method, basically you are using your analyst team, and we've pulled in expertise as well. So, we had the support of Pierre Husky, who is a journalist in France and has been for a while. And he actually has this sort of local knowledge that we don't have. And we're identifying what are the ideological backgrounds, the topics, the political orientations that could help us to build this map. Now, we actually face quite a lot of difficulties in this because, in a way, it's just if you look at this map, we try to combine things or put into one sort of space which are hard to put next to each other. So, to give you an example, is a segment of the political discourse can be beautifully put into this traditional left-right dimension. At the same time, there is this whole new political ideology that is not left-right, which is much more global versus local.
Right, and this is a super interesting aspect that I'm sure we'll be digging into. But
so exactly, and so we needed to somehow to jigsaw it together. Yeah. But anyways, what we defined, and we built sort of you could think of this whole media map as a segmentation on 3 levels. So first, behind it are individual websites that publish content. We've taken these websites and put them into groups of who do similar things. So we have 17 clusters of media sources. These are things like petition, comedy, Protest and Revolution. These are like different groups which can have, couple of websites, but it can have 40 websites, depending on how popular that cluster was and how many websites we found, which were in the top 800.
Right. And I mean, there's I'm looking at, there's an entire range. There's a LGBTQ and human rights cluster. There's an anti-Islam, a pro-Islam, conspiracy, environment. So you would look to see basically what is the central message of the website.
Exactly. But and once we had these clusters, I mean, at the same time, we were able to build sections of the media map. And you already started talking about it. So, we based it and actually, it came to a surprise to many that almost half of the news links shared around the French election were from traditional media.
Right, which is kind of, I think we find this in all sorts of different scenarios and context, which is, in academia, we call it the hybrid media system, which is, originally there was the idea that social media was this, place for everyone to publish content, and it would be a counter narrative to traditional news. But I think over and over again, we find that traditional news outlets, the big players, still maintain a dominant presence online. And you kind of quantify that with basically half, about 48.2% are of the links are coming from traditional news outlets.
Yeah. These are the Le Monde, the local radio stations, the local TV stations, the regional newspaper, links to comments, that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And there's a very, very broad traditional media landscape in France.
Right, because I'm looking at I've read the study, but I don't think the listeners have at this point. You have half coming from traditional, and then you have 4 other categories, which is campaign.
Yes, 7.4. 7.4%, exactly.
Right. So this is the kind of the messages from the candidates or the parties.
Yes, these were websites that clearly were Republican or Front National or candidate sites. I mean, mm-hmm. it was owned by the campaign.
Right. And then, so this is kind of the what you'd expect, traditional news and campaigns. And then you have 3 other categories: extend, reframe, and alternative.
Exactly.
Can you talk about those? Like,
yes,
these are kind of the online element. Like, what can social media bring?
Exactly. And extend is a space which widens the coverage of media. So there we have left blogs, right blogs, LGBTQ, comedy, all kinds of, without wanting to be normative, normal things, where it ranges from sharing opinions to civic journalism, the place of social media, where people actually contribute. And they reference traditional media, also critique it occasionally, but it still has that sense of rationality and actually diving into things in a civilized manner and trying to find more information about something, or presenting, an development or events from a specific point of view, like the LGBTQ.
Right. And then, so it's kind of as the name extend implies, it's kind of an extension of the coverage from these kind of traditional outlets. But then you have the juicy stuff, right, which is the reframe and alternative. And reframe is, I'd rather let you say it, which is this kind of reinterpretation or this reappropriation of news.
Well, let me start somewhere else. A word that we found on these websites across the spectrum, so both hard left, hard right, across the board. In French, it's réinformation. So the re-information, that's the word they use. Mm-hmm. And basically, this section assumes that traditional media is fake. It's the product of an elitist doing, and the information there is just not reliable. So in order to balance things out, people need to be re-informed mm-hmm. to understand the real context.
Right. This is Donald Trump's alternative facts, right?
if you want to call it like that, yeah. So to give you a concrete example that stuck in my mind, I don't remember which website. It was a right-wing website, but there was a news covered in mainstream media, maybe Le Monde, that Norway is the happiest country in the world according to some statistic.
Mm-hmm.
And then this Reframe website picked it up and said, yeah, that's true, but they're lying about the reasons. The reason for Norway being so happy is that 8 of its 15 ministers are hard right. So it takes some level of information from the traditional space, but reframes it in a way by changing the underlying facts that you actually end up with a totally different story.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the difference between the reframe and then the alternative category?
Well, the reframe category actually combats and reflects a lot on traditional media. They have these battles going on. And for example, in the upcoming report, we'll look a lot about the mechanisms through which news are placed. But the alternative section is quite out there. So we found 2 clusters in there. One is the anti-system, and the other one is more the conspiratorial space. In a way, you could see it such that one cluster looks at it's very theological, like it's almost Kabbalistic. So they are actually looking at a worldview which entails Illuminatis and a conspiracy of Jews, but it's in a way inward looking. And then there is this anti-system cluster, which looks at the extremely complex, very often pro-Russian geopolitical contexts that become very quickly so confusing that you have no idea what it's about. Also, what you don't see in the alternative space, there's no differentiation between left and right. It all becomes one mass. You find a lot of characters, like individuals who used to be either hard left or hard right, and they're switching their positions in there. So it's this pastiche of crazy.
Yeah, it's kind of it's interesting because it doesn't quite conform. They're not taking positions based on, these are my left values, these are my right values. It's kind of orthogonal space that's just out there, right?
Yeah, and what we found to be extremely interesting is that although the alternative space in itself through sharing is only 5%, it contaminates the reframe, the section below, which is much bigger, with ideas. So there's lots of anti-Semitism, race, like anti-Islam stuff, like nasty shit. And you will find that creeps into the reframe section. And they are actually, basically taking sources from alternative and counter-positioning it with sources from traditional media.
Right. And this is one of the findings, is that you have this pollination of the alternative into the reframe, but that's kind of independent from the traditional media, right? There's not this, the sharing that's going on is between this kind of space of conspiracy theories and reframing. And then on the other hand, you have a completely almost independent cluster of the election conversation and facts and informed opinions.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we as researchers we're not going to judge.
Right.
And we constantly, it's not our opinion, but we need to, represent it. And actually, having been reading these things for the last month or so, I've come to the conclusion that, okay, I get it. And I get their problem.
Yeah, it's not that there's necessarily, it's not that you can't say that you're, wrong based on your opinions, but the sort of objective finding is that there's not observable interactions between those that engage with this type of news and those that engage with the sort of campaign traditional news.
That's absolutely correct.
There's a split, there's a cleavage, and regardless of which side you're on or how you feel about these issues, the fact is there's not social media in this case, and I think in most cases, is in a place where people are truly kind of, this digital agora idea, people exchanging news and opinions. There's a cleavage between what types of news people are consuming.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at it again now in our second report from the idea of the common ground. How much information do people share that overlaps? And we can actually confirm that finding, having now looked not just at the content and who they cite within the content, but also the sharing behavior around that, especially through influencers and cross-sharing between clusters. And we can see that people actually who share articles from the alternative or reframe section are not sharing content from traditional media.
Mm-hmm. Which is this kind of, echo chambers idea. So most of the study deals with the extend, reframe, and alternative categories. This kind of...
Indeed.
Yes. And you have these different clusters, which are, as we said, the kind of the qualitative categories that you've assigned. And the biggest one is French identity, which had about 11% of links shared within these spaces. So can you talk about the kind of the findings of these clusters, or you categorize these into groups and then looked at the percentage that they made up of this media map, right?
Yes, but just let me be very precise on what exactly these percentages mean. So we've looked at the individual websites that publish articles, and we conducted in-depth content analysis on the types of articles they publish, and we tried to reverse engineer in a way the idea of what does this news source want? What are they wanting to achieve? And for example, you brought up Frenchness. French identity. French identity is a hard right cluster. They are, next to the anti-Islam and the anti-global patriots. There are obviously strong overlaps between these clusters. But the key thing that makes the French identity is that they are seeking to go back to or recreate a sense of traditional, simple French identity where, the cheese was good, the bakers were French, the meat was good, and there wasn't a danger of being outpopulated in a way by Muslims. For example, the section next, or the cluster next to it, the anti-Islam cluster, it focuses only on the issues and problems created by Muslims living in France.
Mm-hmm. And just to give our listeners a sense of the type of content here, I think my favorite part of the study was you break the French identity cluster down into three groups, which is Catholics, so it's kind of religious-based, regionalists, which is kind of the more local identities of different parts, and then the kind of...
Can I jump in there for a second?
Sure.
The regionalists, in order to understand it, you need to understand that their approach to this whole thing is, we've been colonized once by the French. Let's not be colonized again by migrants. And that's how this regionalist perspective comes in.
Mm-hmm. Which, again, fits into this kind of local versus anti-elite narrative, not necessarily left and right.
It sort of merges at that point. When you see that, okay, this regionalist websites exist in Corsica, in Bretagne, and I think in Catalonia or something like this. And it's kind of funny to see how they actually respond to this overall anti-Islamic perspective. With the idea that they've been already colonized once by the French, and they would like to avoid another one.
Yeah, and interestingly, as we're on this point, one thing I found interesting was that this kind of segment of the French identity cluster seemed to very highly praise sort of Central European countries, Viktor Orban from Hungary, for example, in terms of their acceptance of refugees. So interesting connection between kind of French regional identity linking to a kind of Central European, Hungary, Poland attitude towards refugees, seeing these guys as
and in Russia as well.
Yeah, exactly, which we'll get into. But I want to go to the religious part, which is it's not all about Islam and. No,
you're right. The religious part, what we call Catholics, it's Catholic identitarians. It's really basically fighting gay rights.
Yeah, and I just want to read a segment of the study, and I will be normative here because this is a little bit outlandish. But for the Catholics, you say one line of reasoning seen in these sources is that the real problem with gay marriage is that it creates demand for babies, which in turn create inevitable demand for the scientific production of humans. By this line of argument, sources avoid homophobic reasoning and frame their opposition to gay adoption as a struggle against the instrumentalization of the human body. This is a little bit out there in terms that gays shouldn't be allowed to marry because then we won't have any humans left in the world. I mean, this is
Yeah. You must contextualize it. In France, the debate moved on from gay marriage to gay adoption, and apparently it's also mirrored, I think, by Fillon and conservative candidates that okay, they can marry, but let's not allow homosexuals to have babies. So that it's framed with, it's situated within that sort of debate that is playing out in France, but it takes extremely extreme positions.
Right. But I just wanted to point that out because a lot of the coverage has been about, Le Pen and migrants and Islam. And this is a kind of an interesting category that's kind of, it doesn't fit into that paradigm, but it was a part of the debate.
Yes. It fits into this hard right identity-seeking space. For me, for example, what was very interesting about this cluster, especially after having also read it for weeks, is that you sort of eventually get beyond the racism and anti-Semitism, and then you actually see the real problems that they talk about, which is like some suburbs of Paris don't have a French baker anymore. Or, it's very, very simple things that are about basically problems of multicultural societies, but probably because, and now that's my opinion here, is because the elite or the traditional media doesn't actually talk about these problems in a way of not belittling it. These clusters feel that they need to become really shrill and really loud in order to be heard, to bring a point that, there should be good baguettes and also non-halal food in cities,
Yeah, and this is something that, is echoed across many different contexts, which is, and it's also been with Trump in the U.S. election, which is these are legitimate concerns, and these groups do bring up points. And in a democratic society, these voices should be definitely represented, but it's more about the way, or the news sources they cite, the way it's interpreted can be a bit extreme, and
I would challenge the bit.
Yeah, exactly. So what I wanted to ask you about this French identity cluster, which was the most prominent in terms of sharing, is do you think that this has any connection to the kind of French civic culture, right? French are known for having, a very defined set of values, Frenchness, in terms of liberation from the Ancien regime back in the day. Do you think that there's a sort of cultural explanation for this?
Absolutely. Everyone is using that imagery. Front National is really ingenious in using that sort of French historic images and concept. But I think the key thing is that they totally see it differently in a way. They want to go back to a world which was less complex. This was where things worked the French way, and that whole globalist struggle where your job could be undermined by someone in China, or, it is an attempt really to reduce complexity.
Yeah, this kind of collapsing of complex problems into very simple solutions. As I said, looking back to the lack of baguettes, like going back to a day that doesn't reflect the kind of complex realities that we're in.
Yeah. And complex realities are sort of then, painted as an elitist Jewish conspiracy, really, which is what makes this information hard to digest. But what's behind it is that fear of being left behind.
Exactly. And along that line, when we look at these non-traditional media outlets more broadly, you find that there is some sort of connection to Russia or Russian influence, which is obviously a huge issue at the moment. Can you go into that a little bit in terms of what you guys found?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and I want to be again very precise of what we've exactly did, because we are not a cyber
Right.
attribution company. We are a qualitative research shop. So what we've done in order to establish Russian influence is to look at the types of sources these media publishing websites use. So when you go into the social media space in that, one thing you find is that these websites take their news from Le Monde, Le Figaro, Reuters, wherever they take over information from there and comment it or rewrite it or reference it. And so it was actually quite possible to, do they cite traditional news or other websites here in the reframe section, or where does that come from? And what we found was that a large chunk came from Sputnik and from RT, Russia Today, which publishes a lot of content that is not congruent with truth. And also we found another type of websites which were French websites of blogs, but they were clearly marked as Russian. So, you could, with one click, you're reading about something, and then one click later, you find yourself on the Russian Defense Ministry's website.
Mm-hmm.
Both on the hard right and the hard left, they are, and especially in the alternative section, they are like clusters which over 50% of the websites actually take their news from Russian sources.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, what these Russian providers do is basically give a counter narrative to the West, which it's a very logical connection to your reframe category, which is, in terms, if you want to challenge the narrative given by the mainstream media or campaigns, the Russian news sources give you a source to draw from. And I think that's kind of what's at play here.
Yeah, I mean, we've been thinking about this a lot, and there will be a section on this in our second report as well, coming out next week. In a way, and that's again my personal opinion, is that what this Russian propaganda does, it actually hijacks the right's narrative. Because what they say is that, what Putin does is put Russia first, where like every good leader should. And, France should be France first. And then we don't have to bother with it, we will have less conflicts because everyone, the French will look after the French interests first and everything comes second. And because Russia subscribes to this, anyone who criticizes Russia or Russian activities, especially in Syria, is actually a traitor. Does it make sense?
Yeah, no, it does.
That's the logic with which this is being explained. In the last few weeks, the chemical gas attacks in Syria have moved to the forefront of this discourse.
I'm just kind of thinking about it now, which is, it doesn't seem to be so much that people draw necessarily from the content of what the Russian sources are putting out, but it might be more of a way of thinking or a more way of reasoning that's re-implemented by the right in France. So in terms of like the Russians meddling, it might not be so much that people are subscribing to exactly what the sources are saying, but at a more meta level, there's a way that the Russians present news or think about nationalism or politics that is kind of picked up and reappropriated by the right. I think that's what's going on. That's kind of interesting, which is, as you're saying, Russia first. The Russians put this out, and the French non-traditional sites take this, and then they kind of take the same logic and they put it into French first, and they draw upon a lot of the same ways that the Russians present news in the way that they do. So I think it's not so much that they buy what the Russians are saying, but it's this type of argumentation that they're borrowing from.
Well, it sort of gets fused into the overall debate against mainstream media, anti-Americanism. It gets paired with a lot of anti-Semitic, discourse, which we see really strongly both on left and right. It gets meddled into that. So, for example, the type of articles that we've seen that contained Russian influence, as the last few weeks dealt mostly with Syria, there we see sort of three phases. I mean, there's this whole rejection that Russia was involved in the chemical attacks. There's a reduction of, it's not such a big deal. And finally, there's this sort of relativization, sort of reversal, then actually it's the Americans who did it.
Mm-hmm. In the French news.
In the French news about, connected with the elections about Syria.
Mm-hmm. So they can kind of, I guess the Russian news sources can kind of keep using this as keep bringing it up into the...
They keep bringing it up and they keep trying to wash themselves, whitewash themselves from whatever happened in Syria. Mm-hmm. But what was reported that, there was Russian involvement with the bombing, with the chemical gas usage. And they are trying to find ways to make, the target audience not believe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this whole thing is super interesting with with the Russians. But I want to switch gears a bit to the campaign section. So the type of news that the campaigns were putting out. This is something that I'm personally very interested in working on, the connection between campaigns and media in terms of what they're posting on social media. And you find that the large majority of campaigns don't actually cite other sources. They only put out their campaign messages. Do you think that's a way to, is that a strategic choice to control their message and to sort of stay on topic and give only their site and not bring in external sources?
I mean, to be honest, it wasn't the campaign sites. We mapped them to have them on the map and see where they are located. We didn't do a content analysis on their content because we didn't think it was that interesting from our non-traditional point of view here in this study. In a way, I think, they are not different than the advertising boards. It's just simple advertising.
Right. This kind of political marketing.
Well, they are not arguing. They are not, they are organizing local communities. They are, announcing rallies. They share videos. So that's a very conventional marketing space that happens there.
And the reason I ask you about it is because I was just reading a study last night that was looking at how Donald Trump used social media in the American election versus other candidates. And one of the things they said was significant is that he did retweet the kind of average citizen, or he did retweet sources outside of his campaign, which was seen as him being more authentic versus other campaigns that were only giving their message, only shooting, videos from the rallies.
I see what you're saying. Yes, but listen, I think you're right. And you can see that in with the handles of Front National doing the same. Mm-hmm. So they actually, there's a lot of outrageous stuff that is factually not true, that is being reshared by accounts that are close to Front National.
Right.
So that happens.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of understated, which is this has an effect that can help build trust with people who are, identifying with the Front National, because they view it as being open and being more kind of real or authentic versus a campaign that's just giving their own message. It looks very scripted. It looks very, inauthentic and kind of manipulative. Whereas if you bring in external sources, it gives you a sense of credibility, or at least being in touch. That is very powerful, I think.
Well, and it being interwoven into society, absolutely. And you find a lot of brands doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So for me, that's kind of, this is what we deal with every day. This is normal commercial, campaigning.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So that there's nothing non-traditional about that. I mean, obviously, reshare. I mean, it's novel for voices of authority to share their authority and thus, actually build it in this strange way. But this is, the true power of social media.
Exactly. And so on that point, let's talk about the kind of one of the main findings, which was this lack of sharing across these sites. And I think this is super interesting for, academics, policymakers, but also just the general public, is that there is this divide between the mainstream and the sort of the counter narrative. And you really kind of find that, which is there isn't sharing that's going on across these groups.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not sure if you could share one of the graphics from the report.
Yeah, we'll put it up on Twitter and Facebook.
That would be great, because we had it designed in a way that it shows this curvature of the different segments, so that actually you can, when you look at the landscape, you already see that they actually don't see each other. So there's no line of sight between the far sections of the landscape.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because social media, I would kind of expect the opposite, which is because of the algorithms of Facebook, for example, you would kind of expect that even if someone shared a alternative link, that it would somehow permeate the, if your friend or a friend of friend shared the link, you would see it. So one of the things I was wondering in the study, which is maybe you don't measure the exposure, you only measure the act of sharing. So do you think that because of looking only at the shares, you find this divide because people don't reshare it, but they might see it?
Yes, it could be possible. But then again, I mean, think about yourself and how many, I don't know, friends you have who hate Hungarians. I don't know, probably none. So I mean, there's this whole clustering that you see across social media, that you will befriend people and follow people who tend to, whose opinions you tend to respect. Obviously, there are exceptions of it, but what we can't find out with our technology to which segments of society these news actually have traveled. And actually, there is no technology to do that. Maybe governments have some, but commercially, it's not possible.
Yeah, I mean, there's the sort of things that academics are struggling with is to what extent is social media this echo chamber, or does it expose people to diverse opinions? And I mean, there is no answer. We don't have that data.
Yeah, I think it's probably an academic question, because it's more an imprint than part of everyday human life. What I see in it, and this, especially as I compare it with other work that we've done, I mean, is that it speaks to the dissipating trust in the system. Mm-hmm. And we see that, in categories, be that cleaning, baby care, food, travel, really insurances, finances, everywhere. And for me, it resonates with that sort of lack of trust.
Yeah.
Or, to put it the other way, distrust into the system, and being alienated from it, and not believing anything they say is really for me, it's the sort of driving force behind this division of that, the fact that there is there's a schism, really. There's a gap between realities that, at least from where we see it, have fairly little, there are very little bridges between them. So actually, very much to this point, we just completed an analysis that's going to be published next week about the usage of hashtags around the different clusters. And what we found is that the hashtags that are being shared between different clusters are basically only politicians' names, not issues. So the whole clash and the conversation is reduced to, Macron is great, Le Pen is fantastic, or the other way around. But on a broader level, like Islamization or migration or refugees or taxation, there is no discussion where people would share from here and there and expose themselves to ideas. So actually, it's the conflicts or the clashes are limited to basically the images of candidates, rather a broader political contest.
Exactly. And this trend is, I mean, yeah, it's another confirmation of it, which is this personalization. And the thing is that elections kind of get boiled down to battles between, figureheads, these party leaders. And I think, going into the sociology a little bit, there's this idea that these candidates are the kind of symbolic figureheads that the issues aren't being discussed, as you're saying. It's about the candidates, but the candidates are kind of this outlet or this projection for people to identify with. And it's a lot of elections get boiled down to feelings that are kind of represented as the battle between Macron and Le Pen, but it's a more deeper divide between where people are coming from and what they feel. And it in terms of how this plays out on social media, it just dilutes the discourse. It's not substantial. Everyone's coming with their own opinion, and it's very polarized, and it's not very conducive to the democratic process, I think.
Yes, everyone comes with their opinions, but I think what is so scary in a way is that level of distrust that we find in this discourse and in any other discourse that we look at, really. So there's this void of, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to go too deeply into sociology or quote Giddens or something like that, but I mean, people don't believe that traditional media is doing the job, that there's corruption behind everything is not what it seems. So there's this whole, sort of alternative reality that is based on the distrust. And for me, what is super interesting, by the way, is how that sort of distrust that, fake news really, that came out of politics is now present in the food discussion, in the cat food discussion, in, amazing different things.
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, most of our work is actually not, on elections, but it's about dog food or normal consumer goods or cereals. And then we find out what people think, feel, and do around cereals or lamb meat or whatever.
Right.
And we find that same sort of tendencies there as well, of and across different markets, the U.S., Poland, Russia, wherever. That most of these conversations are triggered, especially these negative conversations, are triggered by the fact that people don't trust.
Yeah,
they assume that they're being lied to.
Yeah, I get it, and I think I think you're right. That's the kind of underlying mechanism here. And what I think is interesting is I think there are legitimate reasons to be critical of the media and the way that they have been so commercialized over the past couple decades. And what's interesting, I think, is if you're a news provider now, digital is a huge part of your strategy. You have to be online, and you have to conform to ways that fit the algorithm. You have to basically, news organizations are in contact with Facebook, and Facebook's telling them you need to report more or less this way in order for us to give you coverage. And so it's interesting that there is a huge distrust. The media have to adapt. They basically have to conform to Facebook in order to present their news. And it might dilute the quality of journalism, which then feeds back into distrust. So there's that kind of, I agree that distrust is the mechanism, but I think the danger is that the social media providers have such a influence on how the news reports that ultimately can feed back into distrust through clickbait and, sensational stories that drive engagement but don't report.
I couldn't disagree.
Yeah, I mean, as a side thought, but I just wanted to put it out there. I
think that's a discussion that needs to be had. I mean, when we looked at the mechanisms of delivering what people call fake news, and I think this whole fake news thing is somewhat disturbing in the sense that everyone uses the phrase without actually really knowing what it is. Mm-hmm. So we rather try to use disinformation instead of fake news. But I mean, the one interesting thing that comes out of it is that a lot of the campaigns, fake news campaigns or disinformation campaigns, leverage the brand names of or the mechanisms of traditional press or media to use it against them.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, they would go and write a blog piece on an open blog platform of Mediapart or Le Monde's blogging engine, and then share that, refer to that article as if it would have been written by that respectable media organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's this. Yeah, I don't know. Fake news. It's a complicated issue, but I think you're right in that my beef with it is that there's, as you said, people use it indiscriminately, and I think a lot of what's being called fake news is just very hardly spun in terms of, I guess, this reframe category that you find is that it's not necessarily that it's fake. It's just that it's a very hardly spun opinion that can't really be challenged. I don't know.
Indeed, yes. I mean, it's carefully constructed. It contains enough facts, real facts, for it to be, a formative opinion. But it mixes in elements from, for example, the alternative space that claims that for example, IS is American. It's an American franchise, and it does what Americans do. Mm-hmm. So it would pull in things that's weird. And then the whole article changes, and the meaning of those shared facts is also different.
Exactly, and I think what the again, I would encourage our listeners to go and check out this study, which is it really provides a nice overview of the landscape, which I think is the goal of the study, but it really reaffirms and provides insight at a sort of qualitative level of these exact trends that we're talking about that are not going away, right? They're seen in different contexts, and I think we're kind of starting to boil down what exactly these trends are, what the mechanisms are, and how it's working. And I think that the study is a very good kind of linchpin, I guess. It brings the French context, but it highlights so many larger societal trends that social media brings into politics. But we can talk about this forever. But there's two other reports that you guys are doing, and you've talked about the second one a little bit. So kind of what's next?
Yeah, the second one provides an update on the numbers over the last few weeks since we've locked down our first study, and looks really at this common ground ideas by analyzing the influencers and the hashtag usages, and looks at the emergence of this fake news complex by looking at, in a qualitative way, at the patterns of disinformation and also the narratives that emerge around Russian influence. Mm-hmm. And we took a current topic, Syria, because that sort of dominates the Russian influence articles over the last few weeks.
Right. And so the second study is specifically on hashtags?
Well, it's actually, we've computed the whole thing, so we'll have an update on the social media landscape. Uh-huh. But we've done two more sort of deep dives, one around the hashtag usage and the key influencers who do the sharing of the articles, and a couple of things like the kind of interesting, the symbolism, for example, in Twitter handles, mm-hmm. which I find very fascinating, mm-hmm. of being the usage of iconography, like the frog or that Arabic sign for Christianity, and things like
right
around influencers from belonging to different clusters. And then another part of the study is also looking at the patterns of disinformation and the narrative typology of Russian influence. And then the third report will be actually quite different. It comes out after the elections for the parliament as well, so sort of end of June. And there we are actually going to do something quite different. We are going to look at the comments that people make when sharing these articles. And the objective is really to understand why are they sharing this? What does it give them? What's the sort of rational and emotional need that resonates with people who are engaged in this conversation?
I'm excited for that one. It's something that I work on myself. But we'll tweet those out. We'll throw them up on Facebook when they come out. And then, of course, this study will include a link in the show notes.
Great.
Yeah. So Daniel, thanks so much for taking the time out, and appreciate your insights. And I'm looking forward to the next couple studies.
Super. Great to be on this podcast.
I've just been speaking with Daniel Fazekas, founder of Bakamo Social, a strategic social listening consultancy that looks at how conversations are taking place on social media. You can find the first of their 3-part study on the French election social media landscape by going to bakamosocial.com. And we'll also make sure to shoot those out on our Twitter and Facebook page. That's at SMNP Podcast on Twitter. And if you go on Facebook and type in Social Media and Politics Podcast in the search box, our page should come right up. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the show. I'm your host, Michael Bacetta, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.